Welcome to Christ's Word, where everyday lives meet the light of God's Word. Here, we don't preach. We tell stories. Moments of doubt, turning points, quiet revelations, all woven with raw emotion and unshakable faith. You're not just listening to someone else's journey. You might just find your own reflection in it. And maybe, just maybe, by the end, you'll discover the answer you've been searching for. It was a morning like any other. The sun was barely rising, casting a soft golden glow over the small town. People were starting their day, the smell of fresh coffee filled the air, children were rushing to school, and life seemed to carry on as usual. But for one family, everything was about to change in a way they never saw coming. In the blink of an eye, a devastating accident took the life of a beloved father and husband. The car crash was so sudden, so tragic, that no one had time to process what had happened. The father, a hard-working man, was no longer there to hold his wife's hand, to guide his children through life's challenges. The wife, a loving mother, sat in the sterile hospital waiting room, her heart pounding, her mind in a state of complete shock. The doctors were silent, offering no comforting words. Her world, once full of laughter, warmth, and love, had come crashing down. She was told the news, and everything after that moment felt like it was happening in slow motion, the tears, the disbelief, the utter emptiness. How could this happen? How could she be left alone with her children, her life turned upside down, without a warning, without any chance to say goodbye? The pain was unbearable, a heavy weight crushing her chest. There was no answer, no explanation for why this was happening to them. The woman, now lost in a sea of grief, began to wonder if she could ever find a way to keep going. In the days that followed, the family struggled to come to terms with the unthinkable. The mother had to tell her children that their father wouldn't be coming home. How do you explain such loss to a child who doesn't even fully understand what death is? How do you comfort them when your own heart is broken beyond repair? As the family tried to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, something strange began to happen. The mother, desperate for any sense of relief from the suffocating pain, picked up an old Bible that had been tucked away for years. The words on the pages were faded, but as she flipped through the book aimlessly, one verse caught her eye. She stopped. Something about the words resonated deep within her soul. With God, all things are possible. The words felt like a whisper from the heavens. Could it be? Could the answer to her suffering lie within these pages? But how could she believe it? How could she ever believe that anything good could come from such unbearable pain? The grief was so overwhelming, the loss so fresh, and yet, this verse, these words, seemed to be the only thing that offered even the smallest sliver of hope. But the journey to healing was not going to be an easy one. The path ahead was shrouded in doubt and confusion. How could faith, something so abstract, help in such a tangible, painful moment? The woman found herself torn between the suffocating weight of her grief and the faint flicker of hope that these words might offer. In the coming days, the question loomed, could she truly embrace the possibility of healing? Could faith be the answer, or was it just a false hope, a cruel joke in the face of such overwhelming loss? The family's tragedy had only just begun to unfold, and yet, a small seed had been planted in the mother's heart. A seed that would eventually grow into something far greater than she could ever have imagined. But would she take the first step toward healing, or would the darkness of grief continue to hold her captive? What happens next? How does a mother find hope when it seems like there is none left to hold on to? Stay with us, and let's explore how one woman's journey of faith would change her family's life forever. The atmosphere in the house was still eerily silent, only broken by the heavy sighs of the mother. Everything had become a blur, as if she were living in a nightmare from which there was no escape. She tried to carry on, to give her children a semblance of normalcy, but each passing day felt like a battle against a grief that was impossible to shake. Her children still didn't fully understand the loss, they only knew that their father wouldn't be coming home. But she knew that it was only her who could try to piece together what was left of their shattered lives. How could she hold everything together? Each morning, she woke up with a deep, empty feeling. The world outside seemed to move on as usual, people went to work, children went to school, but for her, everything felt meaningless. Work, friends, life around her couldn't fill the hole inside her heart. She knew she couldn't go on like this forever, but she didn't know how to move forward. The first days after her husband's death felt like a bad dream. She couldn't remember how long it had been. A week? 2 weeks? A month? Perhaps more, but for her, time felt as though it had stopped. Then one day, while standing in the kitchen, her hands unknowingly brushed against an old book on the shelf. It was a Bible, one that hadn't been opened in years. She picked it up, wiped away the dust from the cover, and absent-mindedly opened it. The faded words slowly began to appear in front of her eyes, and suddenly, one verse stood out. She stopped. Something in the words resonated deep within her soul. Your faith will make you strong. She froze. Her heart raced, as if the words had been meant for her. Could it be? How could she believe in something when everything had fallen apart? But strangely, a part of her, a deep part of her, seemed to want to believe. Determined to understand more, she began reading further, even though each word felt like a challenge to her shattered faith. Her world had ceased to be one of certainty. Everything was no longer steady, no longer trusted. She felt the internal conflict. Reason wanted her to shy away from anything to do with religion, but her heart couldn't stop seeking just a little bit of light, even if it was only a faint glimmer in the dark. Could faith really help her through this loss? In the days that followed, she tried to find answers. She went through the motions of daily life, interacting with friends and family, but the more she tried, the more she felt like a stranger in her own world. People around her had moved on, and no one seemed to understand the weight of her grief. No one could truly grasp how alone she felt. The comforting words of friends or family seemed hollow, unable to help her face the truth of her pain. Then, one evening, when she was staring out of the window, an old friend, a former pastor, stopped by unexpectedly. His words felt like a balm on the wound in her heart. I know you're hurting, but God always has a plan, even if we can't see it right now, he said, his gaze full of empathy. Though he didn't speak much, just those words made her feel strangely warm inside. Could it be that the comfort she had been searching for was hidden in God's teachings? She began to understand that perhaps not everything in life could be explained immediately. Sometimes, we have to go through the pain, we have to endure the loss, to find a deeper meaning. As she accepted her grief, she began to realize that not all the darkness in life was insurmountable. And in that moment, a small spark of light began to flicker in her heart. Could she move forward? Could faith help her stand up and start again? The answer could only come if she continued on her journey, knowing that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. And so, her story, of a mother searching for hope, began to take a new turn. Would she find the light, or would she be swept away by the darkness? As the days passed, the weight of her grief didn't lighten. It only seemed to grow heavier with time, as if every step forward was met with another setback. The verse from the Bible kept haunting her thoughts, but it wasn't enough to erase the pain or the deep sense of loss. She began to doubt herself, to question whether it was possible to move beyond the darkness that had enveloped her. How could something as abstract as faith provide solace for something so tangible, so raw? One afternoon, as she was preparing dinner, a knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was her son, barely 8 years old, standing at the doorstep with a crumpled piece of paper in his hand. He had just come back from school, and there was something different about him, a quiet sadness in his eyes. As she looked down at him, her heart broke once more. He was so young, yet had already been forced to face the kind of loss no child should ever experience. "Mom, look," he said softly, handing her the piece of paper. It was a drawing, a picture of their family before the accident, her husband, their children, all smiling together. His small handwriting at the bottom of the drawing read, "Our family is still together, even if we can't see Daddy." Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at her son's innocent words. She realized then that it wasn't just her own grief that she was carrying, it was the grief of her children, too. They were trying to hold it together, trying to make sense of something that made no sense at all. And they were looking to her for strength. That night, after the children had gone to bed, she sat alone in the quiet house, the Bible open in front of her once again. The words that had initially seemed so distant, so foreign, began to feel more like a lifeline. She picked up the Bible and, for the first time, truly prayed. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know how to make the pain go away, but she prayed for strength, for clarity, and for the courage to keep moving forward. God, she whispered, I don't know if I can do this on my own. But if you are there, I need your help. I need to find a way to heal, to show my children that there is still hope. Please, help me. In that moment, as she closed her eyes and felt the weight of the words she had just spoken, something changed. It wasn't a dramatic shift or an immediate miracle, but there was a sense of peace that she had not felt in weeks. She didn't know what it meant yet, but it was a start, a quiet beginning to the healing she had been searching for. The next morning, she woke up with a new sense of determination. She didn't know how to fix everything, or how to erase the pain, but she knew she had to try. She started by talking to her children, letting them know that it was okay to feel sad, but that they didn't have to carry the burden alone. She began to share with them her own struggles, showing them that it was okay to not have all the answers, but that they could trust in the love and support they still had, especially from each other. She began to find small ways to give back to the community, to honor the memory of her husband by continuing to do good in his name. At first, it felt like a struggle, like trying to walk through deep mud, but slowly, things started to shift. She began to find moments of peace, moments when she could look at her children, smile, and feel a flicker of hope. Then, one day, she found herself back at church, sitting quietly in the pew. She had been hesitant to return, unsure of what to expect, unsure if it was right for her to be there. But as she sat in the stillness, something within her felt different. She no longer felt like an outsider, like someone who was simply enduring, but someone who was beginning to believe that there was a path forward, even if she couldn't see it clearly yet. It was in this moment of quiet reflection that she began to realize the power of faith, not just as an abstract concept, but as a source of real, transformative strength. She understood now that faith wasn't about having all the answers or being free from pain. It was about trusting in something greater than herself, even in the darkest moments. And in doing so, she could find a way to help her family heal, one small step at a time. The road ahead was still uncertain. She would still face struggles, and there would be days when the grief would feel overwhelming. But now, for the first time since the accident, she felt a glimmer of hope. A hope that, perhaps, through the power of faith, they could begin to rebuild their lives, together. And with that, she knew the journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. The days that followed were not easy. As much as the mother tried to hold on to the newfound sense of peace, the world around her was still filled with reminders of what had been lost. She saw her children's eyes searching for their father in every corner of the house. They would play quietly in the backyard, asking questions about him as if he were still there, waiting for the next moment to return. Despite her best efforts, she found herself retreating into the shadows of grief once more. Her heart, though lighter in some ways, still carried the weight of unspoken pain. The verses from the Bible that had once seemed like a lifeline now felt like distant echoes, comforting, yes, but not enough to heal the wounds so deeply embedded in her soul. She was caught between the desire to move forward and the pull of the past, and each day was a reminder of the distance she had yet to travel. One afternoon, she sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in her hands, staring blankly at the wall. It was a routine moment, one that had become a part of her life since the tragedy, but this time something was different. The doorbell rang, pulling her out of her reverie. When she opened the door, she was greeted by a woman from her church, someone she barely knew, but someone who had heard about her loss. "I just wanted to stop by and see how you're doing," the woman said with a soft smile, her eyes kind and sincere. It was such a small gesture, but it felt like a lifeline to her. She invited the woman in, and they sat together for a while, talking about everything and nothing at all. The conversation veered from the weather to the challenges of everyday life, but it was the woman's final words that stayed with the mother. "You know," the woman said, "sometimes we have to break in order to be rebuilt. We're not meant to carry our burdens alone. And sometimes, God sends us people, like me, right now, to remind us that we're not forgotten." It was a simple statement, one that may have seemed insignificant to anyone else, but for the mother, it was a revelation. She had been carrying the weight of her grief alone for so long, believing that it was her responsibility to heal on her own. But perhaps, just perhaps, the healing didn't have to come solely from within. Perhaps, she didn't have to do it alone. But even with this new understanding, the internal conflict was far from over. The more she tried to step into the light of faith, the more she was faced with resistance from within herself. Doubts lingered. What if it wasn't enough? What if the pain never really went away? What if, despite everything, she would always be broken? These thoughts consumed her. She struggled to reconcile her desire for faith with the reality of the pain that still gripped her heart. As if to test her resolve, the challenges of daily life seemed to grow larger. Bills piled up. There were moments when the children's grief bubbled to the surface in fits of anger or sadness, and the mother, too exhausted to respond, would retreat again, her heart heavy. And then came the judgment of others, those who couldn't understand her journey, those who told her to move on, or get over it, as though there was an easy way out of the storm that had raged in her heart. One evening, in the midst of all this, she found herself alone in her bedroom, tears silently streaming down her face. She had reached a breaking point. The faith she had clung to felt like it was slipping through her fingers. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay, that her heart was healed, when every fiber of her being was still screaming for relief. And then, in the quietest of moments, when the world seemed to hold its breath, she felt something gentle, yet undeniable. A presence. It wasn't a loud, booming voice or a dramatic moment of divine intervention, but a quiet whisper in her soul, reminding her that she didn't have to have it all figured out. Faith isn't about perfection, the whisper seemed to say. It's about trusting, even when the road is unclear. It's about showing up, even when you don't feel strong. And in that moment, she realized something profound. Her struggle wasn't a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength. The very fact that she was still fighting, still holding on to her children, still trying to believe, meant that she was already healing. Slowly, piece by piece, she was being rebuilt, not because she was perfect, but because she was allowing herself to be vulnerable, to open her heart to both the pain and the healing. The conflict she had faced, her doubts, her fears, were not signs that she had failed, but signs that she was human. And in that humanity, she found a deeper connection to her faith, a faith that didn't promise instant healing or easy answers, but one that offered her the grace to keep going. The next day, she took another small step. She called a close friend, someone she had distanced herself from over the past few weeks, and invited them over for tea. She wasn't ready to share all of her struggles, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to open her heart again, to receive the support that had been waiting for her all along. And in that moment of reaching out, she realized that the healing she sought was not just in finding answers or in perfecting her faith, it was in the simple act of letting go and trusting that she wasn't alone. The days that followed began to feel different. It wasn't that the pain had suddenly disappeared or that the grief had magically melted away. No, the loss was still there, lingering in the quiet moments, in the places where memories used to live. But something inside her had shifted. She had chosen to take a step forward, not because she felt entirely ready or because the world had become easier, but because she was no longer allowing fear to dictate her every move. She started by helping out more at church, taking on small tasks that seemed insignificant but were meaningful in their own right. She'd never imagined herself doing something like this before, not after everything that had happened. But there was a part of her that knew this was what she needed, an opportunity to give, to step outside her grief, and to contribute to something greater than herself. And with each little act of kindness, a small spark of hope reignited within her. She saw the joy in the faces of those she helped, felt the quiet satisfaction of doing something that mattered, no matter how small. She began to realize that her purpose didn't end with the loss of her husband. She had a future to build, not just for herself, but for her children as well. But there were still moments when doubt crept in. There were days when she felt completely overwhelmed by the weight of her responsibility. She had to be the strong one, the one who kept everything together, even when she wasn't sure if she could. The demands of life pressed in on her, and she often felt like she was barely holding on, her resolve shaking at the edges. It was on one of these days, when she was feeling particularly defeated, that something happened that would change everything. As she walked through the church parking lot, a little girl, no older than her youngest child, ran up to her, holding out a small bouquet of wildflowers. The girl's face was beaming, her innocence shining through as she handed the flowers to the mother. "Thank you for helping," the little girl said, her voice full of gratitude. "My mommy says you've been so kind to everyone. I wanted to give these to you." The gesture, so pure and simple, brought tears to her eyes. In that moment, she realized that kindness wasn't just about the big, grand gestures, it was about the little things, the moments that connected us to one another. The love she had shared with others, even in her darkest times, was coming back to her in ways she hadn't expected. And as she looked at the child, holding the flowers with such sincerity, something inside her clicked. This was what healing looked like. It wasn't about the absence of pain, or the complete removal of grief. It was about embracing the pain and moving forward despite it. It was about choosing to love and serve others even when life felt unfair. She had learned that healing wasn't just a destination, it was a journey, and it would take time. But she didn't have to walk that path alone. The following week, she began to open up more to those around her. She reconnected with old friends, allowed herself to lean on others, and let herself be vulnerable in a way she had never allowed before. It was humbling, and at times uncomfortable, but it was necessary. She had spent so much of her life thinking she had to be self-sufficient, to always have it all together. But now, she saw that true strength came from admitting weakness and allowing others to help carry the load. And then came the turning point. One evening, as she sat at the dinner table with her children, she realized something she hadn't before. They had begun to smile more, to laugh more, to come back to life in ways she had feared were lost forever. She was no longer just their mother, she was their partner in healing. She was showing them that it was okay to feel pain, but it was also okay to embrace the future, to find joy even in the midst of sorrow. That night, she knelt beside her children as they prayed before bed. She wasn't sure if she believed the way she once had, but she knew that the act of praying, the act of giving thanks, was a step towards something greater. It was a way of showing her children that no matter what had happened, there was always something to be grateful for. And as they all said amen, she felt something new in her heart, a sense of peace, of surrender, of quiet strength. The journey was far from over. There would be days when the pain would feel unbearable again, when the darkness would return to cloud her thoughts. But for the first time in a long time, she felt confident that she could navigate those dark days, knowing that there was light waiting on the other side. And perhaps the most important realization of all was that healing didn't come from waiting for everything to be perfect. It came from choosing to keep moving forward, one small step at a time, even when the way ahead was unclear. Through love, through faith, and through the simple acts of kindness, she had begun to heal. And in doing so, she had found a strength she never knew she had. Her family, her children, her community, they were all walking this journey with her, and together, they would rise again. The weeks that followed were filled with small victories and quiet realizations. It wasn't that the pain had disappeared, or that life had returned to the way it was before. There was still a shadow of grief that loomed over the family, still moments when the absence of her husband was painfully clear. But something had changed within her. The days were no longer solely defined by sorrow, and she had learned to embrace the moments of joy, no matter how fleeting. One particular day, as she watched her children playing in the yard, their laughter ringing out in the open air, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. The house was not just a place of mourning anymore, it had started to feel like a home again, a home filled with the love and light that had been so deeply buried under the weight of loss. She had grown, and so had they. Her children, though still missing their father terribly, were beginning to flourish again. They were learning to laugh, to love, and to live in the present moment, something their mother had been unable to do for so long. The healing had come in waves, some gentle, some overwhelming, but always gradual, like the tide that eventually reshapes the shore. But then, as if life were reminding her that healing was not a linear path, came a moment that would test everything she had learned so far. She received a letter one morning, a letter that carried news she had not been prepared for. It was a legal notice regarding the estate of her late husband, an unexpected complication in the already difficult process of moving forward. The letter stated that a portion of her husband's estate, which had been left in trust for her and the children, was now contested by distant relatives. The battle over the property was not just about material things, it was about the very legacy her husband had hoped to leave for them. The grief she had already carried now felt compounded by a new wave of frustration, anger, and helplessness. For the first time in a long while, she found herself on the verge of despair. It seemed as though the universe had decided that her family would never truly know peace. How could she fight this battle while still trying to heal from the last? How could she be strong enough to protect her children when she was still piecing together her own strength? She spent days pacing the house, torn between wanting to face the challenge head-on and wanting to retreat into the comfort of the past. The burden felt so heavy, too heavy for one person to bear. Her faith, which had once given her hope, now seemed distant again, as though she had been abandoned to navigate this new storm alone. The anger and the pain surged back, threatening to overwhelm her. It was during one of these moments, as she sat in the quiet of the evening, feeling utterly defeated, that her son came to her. He was holding a small wooden cross, one that his father had made before his death. He handed it to her with quiet reverence, as though he knew that this simple object could offer something she could not find in any other way. "Mom," he said, his voice small yet steady, "I know we don't have Daddy here with us, but I know he would want us to be strong. He always said that no matter how hard things get, we can get through it if we have faith in God. We don't have to do it alone, right?" Her son's words, simple and innocent, were like a healing balm to her wounded heart. She realized, in that moment, that she had been so focused on the external battles that she had neglected the internal strength she had built. She had learned to love again, to trust again, but she had yet to fully understand that the healing she sought would not always come from external circumstances. Faith, as her son had so wisely reminded her, was not about waiting for everything to be perfect. It wasn't about waiting for the world to stop hurting, for the pain to end, or for life to return to what it had been. Faith was about finding strength in the midst of struggle, about standing firm even when the ground beneath your feet feels unstable. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of it all, but also feeling a new sense of clarity. The journey she had been on, her path of grief, loss, and healing, had led her to this moment. It wasn't about defeating the darkness, it was about learning to walk through it, knowing that the light would come again, even if it wasn't always visible. Her faith was not some distant ideal, it was a practical strength that she could draw on every day, a strength that would allow her to face this new challenge with courage. The battle over her husband's estate wasn't going to be easy, but she had learned that no battle, no matter how difficult, could diminish the love and strength she had within her. She would fight, not just for the material things that were at stake, but for the legacy of love and faith that her husband had left behind. And so, with renewed determination, she made a decision. She would face this challenge, not as a woman broken by grief, but as a woman who had learned to embrace the hard work of healing, of moving forward. She would trust in the lessons of faith and love that had carried her this far, and she would keep fighting, no matter what the future held. In that moment, she knew that true healing wasn't about reaching some final destination, it was about the journey itself. It was about choosing to keep going, one step at a time, with faith in herself and in God. The storm wasn't over, but she had found a way to stand strong in the midst of it, and for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace with the person she had become. She wasn't the same woman who had lost everything. She was a woman who had found hope again, and who now knew that no matter how hard life became, she could overcome it. The journey had not been easy, but it had been worth it. And with that realization, she was ready for whatever came next. As the months passed, the world around her began to feel different. It wasn't a dramatic change, nor was it a sweeping miracle, but there was a quiet shift, a transformation that was slow, almost imperceptible, but real. She had come a long way from the woman who had once been consumed by grief, a woman who couldn't imagine life without her husband. Now, as she looked back on everything she had endured, she saw that her journey had been one of rebuilding, of reclaiming not just her life, but the hope that had once seemed so out of reach. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch watching her children play, the sound of their laughter filled the air like music. They were happy again, and so was she, in a way that felt genuine and true. The wounds were still there, but they were no longer raw, they had begun to heal. And the scars they left behind weren't reminders of weakness, but of resilience. She had fought hard for this peace, and though the road had been long, she knew that she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected to the people she loved. She had learned that healing wasn't about perfection, it was about acceptance. It was about learning to live with the pain, to walk through the darkness, and to find moments of light even when everything seemed impossible. She had learned that faith wasn't just about believing in the good times, it was about trusting in the unseen, even when life didn't make sense. And most importantly, she had learned that love, no matter how much it had been tested, was still the most powerful force in her life. There were still hard days. Days when the grief would return like an unexpected storm, days when she would miss her husband more than words could express. But those days no longer defined her. She had learned to face them head-on, to allow herself to feel the pain, but also to trust that, just like the storms that came and went, the darkness would pass, and the sun would shine again. One evening, as she tucked her children into bed, she looked down at them and smiled. They had come so far, and so had she. She had never imagined that they could find happiness again, that they could heal in such a way. But they had, together. And now, she was ready to face whatever the future held, knowing that she had the strength to handle whatever challenges might come. As she sat in the quiet of her home, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point, she realized that it was not just a story of loss, but of hope. It was the story of a woman who, despite losing everything, had found the courage to live again. It was the story of a mother who had carried her family through the darkest times and had shown them that love and faith could carry them through anything. And it was the story of a family that, despite the pain they had endured, had found the strength to rebuild, to embrace life once more. And now, as she looked out the window at the setting sun, she knew that the greatest lesson of all was this: the power to heal, to hope, and to love again, was within her all along. She had found it, not by avoiding the pain, but by walking through it, step by step, with faith in herself, in her family, and in God. Her journey had been long, and it had been hard, but it had also been beautiful. And as she turned off the light and whispered a prayer of gratitude, she knew that the healing was far from over. But she was no longer afraid of the future. For the first time, she felt truly at peace, knowing that no matter what came next, she was ready. She had made it through the storm, and now, she was ready to embrace the rest of the journey, together with her family, with love, and with the unshakable faith that had carried her through the hardest days of her life. Start your day thanking God, she whispered quietly to herself, a phrase that had become a daily ritual, a reminder that, no matter how challenging life could be, there was always something to be grateful for. And in that gratitude, she found peace. In that peace, she found strength. And in that strength, she knew they would be okay.